When we think about the medieval world, we often imagine armored knights, towering castles, candlelit monasteries, and kings ruling by divine right. Yet beneath the surface of that distant era were quiet decisions, sometimes made in cramped royal chambers, sometimes in drafty abbeys, sometimes on muddy battlefields, that reshaped the structure of the modern world in ways few at the time could have imagined. In the early 13th century, when a group of English barons forced King John to seal the Magna Carta in 1215, they were not drafting a blueprint for modern democracy. They were protecting their own feudal privileges against a monarch they believed had overstepped. Yet that reluctant royal seal on a parchment by the River Thames planted a seed that would grow into the idea that even a king is subject to the law. Over centuries, that principle echoed through legal traditions, influenced parliamentary systems, and crossed oceans to shape constitutional thinking in emerging nations. It was not a grand proclamation of universal liberty at the time, but a tactical concession in a power struggle, and still it quietly altered the balance between ruler and ruled for generations to come. Elsewhere in medieval Europe, another decision unfolded not on a battlefield, but in scriptoria and universities, where scholars began rediscovering and translating ancient texts. When intellectuals in places like Toledo undertook the translation of Arabic and Greek works into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries, they were responding to curiosity, patronage, and religious motivations, rather than planning a scientific revolution. Through these translations, the works of Aristotle, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, re-entered Western Europe. This reintroduction transformed education, philosophy, and theology, eventually influencing the scholastic method and laying the intellectual groundwork that would support the Renaissance, and later the scientific revolution. The decision to translate, copy, and debate these texts fostered a culture of inquiry that would, over centuries, encourage questioning, experimentation, and systematic observation. In 1095, when Pope Urban the Third crusade at the Council of Clermont, the immediate goal was to reclaim Jerusalem and assist Byzantine Christians, but the consequences radiated far beyond the Levant. The Crusades intensified contacts between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, facilitating trade, cultural exchange, and the transfer of knowledge. Italian city. States such as Venice leveraged crusading logistics into commercial empires, expanding maritime trade networks that enriched Europe and stimulated urban growth. These developments strengthened merchant classes, weakened purely feudal economic structures, and helped usher Europe gradually toward a more complex commercial economy. The decision to launch a holy war framed in spiritual rhetoric indirectly accelerated economic and social transformations that would contribute to the rise of capitalism. Another quiet yet transformative decision occurred within monasteries, where Benedictine and later Cistercian communities chose to systematize agricultural labor and land management. Their emphasis on efficient farming techniques, watermills, and organized estates improved productivity across large swaths of Europe. By draining marshes, clearing forests, and cultivating new lands, these religious communities increased food production and supported population growth. The medieval agricultural expansion allowed towns to grow, markets to flourish, and labor specialization to emerge. Without these incremental choices about land use and resource management, the demographic and economic foundation necessary for later urbanization, might have been far weaker. In the Iberian Peninsula, the gradual Reconquista involved countless military and political decisions, but one of the most consequential came in 1492, when the rulers of a newly unified Spain chose to sponsor a Genoese navigator's westward voyage. When Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon agreed to back Christopher Columbus, they were seeking new trade routes and wealth, not the discovery of a continent unknown to them. Yet their financial gamble connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a web of exchange that would become the Columbian Exchange, reshaping global diets, economies, and populations. Crops like potatoes and maize transformed European agriculture. Silver from the Americas flooded global markets. Devastating diseases altered indigenous civilizations. A single funding decision at the close of the medieval period accelerated the emergence of a truly globalized world. Meanwhile, in England, the establishment of common law under monarchs like Henry II of England involved administrative choices about royal courts and standardized legal procedures. By sending royal judges across the kingdom and recording decisions, the Crown created a more unified legal framework. This strengthened central authority, but also promoted consistency and predictability in justice. The idea that legal precedent matters and that law can be systematized would later underpin legal systems in countries influenced by English governance. What began as a strategy to consolidate royal power evolved into a legal tradition that values continuity, recorded judgments, and the rule of law. The founding of medieval universities represented another subtle but monumental shift. Institutions such as the University of Bologna and the University of Paris were established to train clergy and professionals. Yet they became centers of intellectual autonomy. The decision to organize scholars and students into corporate bodies with charters and privileges fostered a culture in which debate, disputation, and specialized study thrived. Universities preserved knowledge during turbulent times and cultivated generations of thinkers who would question inherited assumptions. Over centuries, these academic traditions evolved into research institutions central to technological innovation and scientific progress. Technological choices also mattered. The gradual adoption of the heavy plough in northern Europe allowed farmers to cultivate dense clay, rich soils more effectively, increasing yields and enabling the growth of stable communities in previously marginal lands. Similarly, the widespread use of the watermill and windmill mechanized labor, freeing human energy for other tasks and contributing to economic diversification. Though no single inventor claimed these tools as world-changing breakthroughs, communities that embraced them improved productivity and resilience, setting the stage for more complex economic systems. In the political sphere, the decision by various medieval rulers to convene representative assemblies to secure taxation or support had unintended consequences. In England, the evolution of Parliament from a feudal council into a body that included commoners marked a gradual shift toward participatory governance. Monarchs who summoned representatives to legitimize taxation inadvertently strengthened the concept that consent matters in governance. These assemblies would, centuries later, serve as foundations for constitutional monarchies and democratic states. The invention and spread of the printing press in the mid-15th century is often associated with the early modern period, yet its roots lay in medieval craft traditions and manuscript culture. When Johannes Gutenberg refined movable type around 1440, he was building upon centuries of experimentation with inks, presses, and bookmaking. The decision to mechanize text production drastically reduced the cost of books and accelerated the dissemination of ideas. Religious reform, scientific debate, and political philosophy all benefited from printed materials. Though Gutenberg sought commercial success, his press became a catalyst for mass communication, literacy, and the democratization of knowledge. Far from Europe, medieval decisions in other regions also reshaped global trajectories. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire's policy of protecting trade routes across Eurasia created the Pax Mongolica, facilitating unprecedented movement of goods, people, and ideas. By choosing to secure and maintain the Silk Roads rather than merely plunder them, Mongol rulers enabled exchanges that connected East and West more closely than ever before. Technologies like gunpowder and paper, along with artistic motifs and religious ideas, traveled these routes, subtly knitting continents together. In East Asia, decisions by Song dynasty officials to support civil service examinations strengthened meritocratic governance and bureaucratic continuity. The emphasis on Confucian scholarship and standardized testing influenced governance models for centuries, shaping administrative systems in China and neighboring regions. These structures demonstrated the viability of a professional bureaucracy selected through examination rather than hereditary privilege, a concept that would inspire reformers in other parts of the world much later. Even moments of crisis led to transformative choices. During the Black Death in the 14th century, as plague decimated populations across Europe, labor shortages forced landowners and governments to reconsider economic arrangements. Attempts to freeze wages or bind workers to the land often failed, and over time the scarcity of labor improved bargaining power for peasants and urban workers. The demographic catastrophe weakened rigid feudal bonds and encouraged mobility and social change. Though no one chose the plague, the policy responses to it reshaped social hierarchies and economic relationships. Maritime innovations, including the refinement of the compass and improvements in ship design, were incremental yet decisive. There were still further medieval decisions, subtle, procedural, almost mundane at the time, that slowly re-engineered the foundations of global civilization. One of the most transformative was the normalization of permanent taxation tied to public purpose rather than temporary war levies. As kingdoms matured, rulers increasingly justified taxes for maintaining roads, fortifications, courts, and administrative staff. This shift reframed governance from episodic mobilization to continuous service. Once taxation became regular and institutionalized, the expectation that government had ongoing responsibilities to infrastructure and security quietly took root. The refinement of legal appeal systems further reshaped justice. Medieval rulers who allowed subjects to petition higher authorities for review of local rulings created hierarchical legal structures. These appeals mechanisms reduced arbitrary power and strengthened centralized oversight. Over generations, the habit of appealing injustice embedded the belief that law must answer to principles beyond local control. Medieval port authorities also began regulating harbor traffic, levying duties, and maintaining shipping records. These practices standardized maritime commerce and created predictable trade environments. Ports became bureaucratic hubs, not just commercial ones. Administrative discipline in coastal cities helped turn maritime trade into a reliable engine of economic growth. The establishment of collegiate bodies within universities, self-governing communities of scholars, was another quiet innovation. These colleges controlled their finances, set internal rules, and preserved academic continuity. The idea that intellectual institutions could operate autonomously while serving broader society influenced later research institutions and academies. The adoption of mechanical clocks in urban centres gradually reshaped labour discipline. Markets opened and closed at fixed hours. Workdays became structured by measurable time rather than solely by sunlight. This increasing precision prepared societies psychologically for later industrial rhythms. In agricultural regions, irrigation systems and shared water rights agreements required negotiation and codification. Communities formalized allocation rules to prevent conflict. This cooperative environmental management strengthened collective governance. The emergence of diplomatic marriages between ruling houses stabilized territories without warfare. Dynastic unions reconfigured political maps and reduced prolonged conflict. These negotiated alliances demonstrated that political power could expand through strategy rather than force alone. Medieval notarial systems formalized business and property transfers. Professional record keepers ensured authenticity and continuity. Their standardized formats created legal clarity across regions. The gradual consolidation of territorial sovereignty reduced internal fragmentation. As rulers asserted authority within defined borders, private warfare declined. Centralized justice replaced local vendettas, increasing social stability. In commerce, regulated marketplaces required official inspection of goods and weights. Fairness in trade became a governance concern. Trust in market integrity expanded participation and encouraged economic diversification. The preservation of classical knowledge through translation and commentary ensured intellectual continuity. Scholars compared interpretations, debated ideas, and refined arguments. This layered scholarship prevented intellectual stagnation and nurtured analytical thinking. The codification of maritime insurance allowed investors to finance risky voyages. Risk distribution encouraged exploration and expansion of trade networks. Medieval guild structures offered mutual aid for members facing illness or loss. These communal protections functioned as early social safety nets. The establishment of standing bureaucracies reduced dependence on charismatic rulers. Institutional roles outlasted individual personalities, creating political continuity. Standardized coin minting practices reinforced economic reliability. Confidence in currency stability fostered long-distance trade and financial trust. Urban councils gradually formalized election procedures for local officials. Participatory governance practices, even when limited to certain classes, embedded habits of civic engagement. The spread of vernacular legal texts broadened understanding of rights and obligations. Legal literacy slowly expanded beyond clerical elites. The refinement of siege engineering and fortification architecture demonstrated adaptability to technological change. Institutions evolved under pressure rather than collapsing. The establishment of Regional merchant alliances created economic interdependence that reduced incentives for conflict. Monastic agricultural estates optimized production and storage, buffering communities against famine. Over centuries, these incremental reforms interlocked. Written records supported taxation systems. Taxation financed infrastructure. Infrastructure strengthened trade. Trade fostered urbanization. Urbanization stimulated education and professional specialization. Professionalization reinforced bureaucratic governance. Medieval societies confronted immense uncertainty, plague, war, climatic shifts, but responded with organization rather than disintegration. They built systems capable of absorbing shock. Those systems formed durable frameworks that later centuries expanded. Modern institutions, courts, parliaments, universities, financial markets, professional bureaucracies are refinements of medieval experiments. The expectation of documented authority, regulated commerce, standardized law, and structured education traces back to those centuries. The medieval world was not merely a bridge between ancient and modern eras. It was a workshop of institutional endurance. Its people addressed immediate needs with practical solutions. Those solutions hardened into structures, structures intertwined into systems. Systems survived upheaval. In candlelit halls, fortified towns, bustling ports, and quiet monasteries, decisions were made that seemed local and temporary. Yet collectively, they shaped global patterns of governance, economy, and knowledge. The architecture of modern civilization rests upon those layered medieval choices. Choices that quietly, persistently, and irreversibly changed the world. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped how societies understood legitimacy, labor, identity, and continuity in ways so gradual that their impact is often invisible today. One of the most profound shifts was the gradual recognition that rulers needed administrative continuity beyond their own lifetimes. Medieval monarchs increasingly ensured that records, treasuries, and legal precedents were preserved across reigns. This decision, to treat governance as an enduring structure rather than a temporary household, created the foundation for the modern concept of the state as something permanent and impersonal. The crown became more than the individual wearing it. The expansion of written vernacular chronicles also influenced collective memory. When histories were composed in local languages, populations gained access to shared narratives of origin, struggle, and triumph. These stories strengthened emerging national identities. Identity became tied not just to immediate loyalty, but to a remembered past. The cultivation of historical consciousness during the medieval period deeply influenced later nationalism. In commerce, the development of merchant credit networks across families and regions created trust-based systems that transcended geography. Letters of recommendation and financial correspondence formed webs of reliability. Reputation became capital. This emphasis on credibility remains central to modern economic life. Medieval rulers who codified uniform legal standards across territories reduced fragmentation. When regional customs were harmonized into broader frameworks, subjects experienced greater predictability. Uniform law strengthened centralized administration and facilitated interregional trade. The structuring of apprenticeship contracts formalized career progression. Young workers were bound by defined terms of training and expectation. This institutionalization of professional development created transferable skills and preserved technical expertise. The growth of maritime navigation schools and accumulation of seafaring knowledge professionalized exploration. Navigational skill became a discipline rather than a gamble. Urban fortification planning often required collective funding and coordination. Shared defense projects fostered civic solidarity and institutional cooperation. The increasing reliance on documentation in property transactions reduced disputes and encouraged investment. Secure property rights stabilized economies and supported long-term planning. The medieval development of ecclesiastical courts introduced alternative judicial systems that sometimes operated independently of secular authority. This layered legal environment required negotiation and defined jurisdictional boundaries. The monetization of feudal obligations gradually replaced labor service with financial payment. This shift increased economic flexibility and encouraged market participation. Medieval scholars who catalogued natural phenomena, even within theological frameworks, preserved observational habits. Careful record, keeping of eclipses, weather patterns, and agricultural cycles contributed to practical knowledge. The institutionalization of libraries and scriptoria ensured organized preservation of manuscripts. Cataloging systems allowed intellectual accumulation across generations. Merchant guilds standardized product quality, reinforcing consumer trust and cross-regional trade reliability. There were still other medieval decisions, less dramatic than wars, less visible than cathedrals, that quietly redirected the trajectory of civilization. One of the most transformative was the normalization of bureaucratic correspondence. As kingdoms expanded, rulers increasingly relied on written letters, decrees, and recorded instructions sent across territories. Chanceries developed formulaic language to ensure clarity and consistency. Over time, this standardization reduced confusion and prevented local reinterpretation of royal will. The habit of procedural writing strengthened centralized governance and introduced the expectation that authority should be documented, traceable, and archived. Modern administrative states function on this same principle of recorded communication. The medieval refinement of commercial credit also deserves attention. Merchants learned to operate on promises of payment rather than immediate exchange. Bills of exchange allowed traders to move capital across borders without transporting coins physically. This innovation reduced theft risk and expanded the scale of commerce. The decision to trust written financial instruments instead of metallic currency alone represented a psychological shift toward abstract economic systems. Global finance today rests upon that same trust in symbolic value. The growth of port cities transformed not only trade but cultural identity. Ports became melting pots of languages, religions, and customs. Authorities who tolerated diversity for economic gain inadvertently fostered pluralistic environments. Exposure to multiple cultures weakened isolation and stimulated innovation. These urban crossroads modeled coexistence through shared economic interest. Medieval rulers also experimented with census, like surveys to determine taxable resources. Counting households and cataloguing assets required administrative sophistication. It also reflected a new way of conceptualizing society as a population that could be measured and managed. This mindset laid groundwork for demographic governance and statistical policy, making the standardization of academic curricula across universities created intellectual unity. Scholars traveling from one institution to another could expect familiar structures of study. This portability of knowledge encouraged academic mobility and strengthened shared intellectual culture across regions. The development of maritime insurance and risk sharing mechanisms allowed merchants to undertake voyages previously deemed too dangerous. By distributing risk across investors, commerce expanded dramatically. This innovation reduced fear and encouraged bold exploration. In rural communities, communal field systems required collective agreement on planting, harvesting, and fallow cycles. These coordinated agricultural rhythms fostered cooperation and mutual accountability. Shared economic survival cultivated negotiation skills that later translated into civic governance. The increased reliance on professional notaries and scribes ensured that contracts and agreements were recorded accurately. These professionals became trusted intermediaries in legal and economic life. Their existence institutionalized expertise in documentation. The codification of market regulations, such as price controls during shortages, reflected recognition that unchecked economic behavior could destabilize society. Though enforcement varied, the principle that markets required oversight became embedded in governance. Medieval intellectual engagement with classical philosophy preserved logical frameworks. Scholars debated metaphysics, ethics, and law with structured rigor. This intellectual continuity ensured that reasoned argument survived turbulent centuries. The gradual shift toward artillery-based fortifications demonstrated adaptability. As military technology changed, architects redesigned cities and castles accordingly. This responsiveness to innovation exemplified a broader medieval pattern. Institutions evolved under pressure rather than collapsing. The expansion of merchant diasporas connected distant economies. Communities established trade outposts while maintaining cultural cohesion. These networks facilitated long-distance exchange and information flow. The organization of craft production within guild halls created predictable supply chains. Quality standards and apprenticeship systems maintained consistency. This reliability strengthened trade reputations across regions. The development of monastic agricultural estates introduced efficient land management practices. Surplus production supported population growth and economic diversification. Even religious festivals contributed to economic integration. Pilgrimages and feast days stimulated trade and mobility, linking distant communities through shared observance. The increasing use of maritime maps improved navigation accuracy. Each voyage refined collective geographic knowledge, gradually shrinking perceived distances between continents. Medieval scholarship also refined methods of textual analysis. Comparing manuscript variants encouraged critical thinking about sources. This habit of scrutiny influenced later historical and scientific methodology. The emergence of civic militias empowered towns to defend themselves. Shared defense responsibilities strengthened communal identity and political agency. Over centuries, these layered decisions accumulated. They reshaped governance from personal command to institutional administration. They transformed economies from localized barter to interconnected markets supported by credit. They shifted knowledge from isolated manuscripts to structured academic systems. They converted legal practice from ritual ordeal to documented procedure. They turned scattered territories into defined political entities. The medieval era functioned as a vast workshop of institutional experimentation. Solutions developed for immediate challenges: security, trade, famine, conflict, hardened into durable systems. Those systems interlocked, reinforcing one another. Modern society rests upon these foundations: bureaucratic states, regulated markets, professional armies, universities, financial networks, urban governance, and international diplomacy all carry medieval DNA. The world did not leap from antiquity into modernity. It was constructed gradually through centuries of pragmatic decisions. In candlelit scriptoria, crowded marketplaces, fortified councils, and windswept harbours, medieval individuals addressed the concerns of their own time. They sought order, stability, prosperity, and meaning. Yet in solving their present, they quietly engineered humanity's future. The structures that govern contemporary life, documentation, contracts, taxation, professional certification, infrastructure, institutional continuity, are the distant echoes of medieval innovation. The era often portrayed as static was, in truth, dynamic and adaptive. It built not merely castles and cathedrals, but systems. And those systems became the architecture of the modern world. There were still deeper medieval decisions that reshaped not just institutions, but the invisible architecture of how societies functioned over long stretches of time. One of the most important was the gradual separation between public office and private property. In earlier eras, rulers often treated territory as personal possession, indistinguishable from family wealth. Over time, however, administrative practices began distinguishing royal treasury from private estates. Offices became roles with defined responsibilities, rather than extensions of personal household authority. This distinction, imperfect at first, slowly built the idea that governance belonged to an enduring state rather than to a single individual. Modern public administration rests on that medieval shift toward institutional continuity. The refinement of feudal contracts also contributed to broader contractual thinking. When vassals swore homage in exchange for land, the relationship was framed as reciprocal obligation. Though unequal, it formalized mutual duties. Over generations, this language of obligation expanded beyond aristocratic circles into commercial and civic life. Society increasingly operated through negotiated terms rather than purely imposed commands. Medieval coinage reforms reflected awareness that economic stability required credibility. Debasement of currency caused distrust and inflation. So rulers who maintained consistent coin quality strengthened trade networks. Stable money encouraged saving and investment. The expectation that governments should preserve currency reliability became a long-term principle of economic governance. The establishment of permanent courts in fixed locations allowed legal consistency to develop. When judges heard cases regularly and recorded decisions, precedent emerged. Precedent created legal predictability, and predictability supported commerce and social stability. Modern legal systems still depend on the continuity of recorded judgment. The growth of interregional fairs functioned as early economic accelerators. Merchants from distant territories gathered under temporary legal protections granted by rulers. These fairs standardized contracts and resolved disputes through recognized procedures. Trust in these temporary safe zones demonstrated how law could create space for prosperity. In maritime regions, ship registries and ownership documentation clarified responsibility for cargo and crew. This administrative clarity reduced conflict and encouraged investment in larger fleets. Structured shipping practices contributed to the expansion of global trade routes. Medieval scholars also systematized libraries, categorizing texts by subject and author. Classification improved accessibility and preserved intellectual organization. This habit of ordering knowledge influenced later cataloging systems. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped how humans imagined authority over nature, over knowledge, and over one another. Transformations that did not announce themselves as revolutions, yet steadily redirected the course of global history. One of the most profound shifts was the growing belief that the world operated according to discoverable principles. Medieval scholars, even within deeply religious frameworks, increasingly sought rational explanations for natural phenomena. The decision to reconcile faith with reason, rather than reject one in favor of the other, encouraged structured inquiry. This intellectual balance prevented total intellectual stagnation and preserved space for future scientific development. By treating the universe as orderly and intelligible, medieval thinkers laid conceptual foundations that later enabled systematic experimentation. The expansion of maritime law was another quiet evolution. As trade intensified across seas, disputes inevitably arose over cargo, shipwrecks, and contracts. Merchant communities and rulers responded by formalizing rules governing liability and ownership. These early maritime codes allowed commerce to flourish beyond local boundaries. Trust in predictable legal frameworks reduced the fear of loss and encouraged investment in long-distance ventures. The increasing use of paper money in parts of Asia during the medieval era reflected bold administrative experimentation. Governments recognized that currency could be symbolic rather than purely metallic. This conceptual leap, trusting value represented by paper, demonstrated faith in institutional authority. The principle that money's worth derives from collective confidence continues to underpin global financial systems. Urban fortifications and city planning also influenced long-term political development. When communities invested collectively in walls, gates, and public infrastructure, they reinforced shared identity and mutual defense. Civic responsibility expanded beyond family or clan. Public works projects required coordination, taxation, and accountability, skills essential to modern municipal governance. The evolution of apprenticeship systems structured economic continuity. By binding young workers to masters for years of training, medieval societies ensured knowledge transmission across generations. Skilled labor became formalized, and technical expertise gained social value. This model of professional training influenced later educational institutions and industrial workforce development. In religious governance, the codification of canon law created a parallel legal system that operated across political borders. Ecclesiastical courts handled matters of marriage, inheritance, and morality. The existence of overlapping jurisdictions required negotiation and refinement of legal authority. These complexities contributed to evolving concepts of jurisdiction, sovereignty, and legal pluralism. The medieval embrace of communal decision making in certain regions fostered early participatory traditions. Village councils regulated agricultural practices and resolved disputes. While limited in scope, these assemblies embedded habits of deliberation and compromise. Collective governance became a practiced skill rather than an abstract idea. The development of cross-cultural trade routes across the Sahara and along the Silk Roads demonstrated strategic coordination between distant civilizations. Rulers who secured these routes ensured the steady flow of gold, spices, textiles, and knowledge. These networks facilitated not only commerce but also intellectual exchange. Technologies and ideas migrated across continents, subtly reshaping societies far from their origin. Military orders such as the Knights Templar and Hospitallers combined religious purpose with financial innovation. These organizations managed vast networks of property and even developed early banking services for pilgrims. Their administrative sophistication showed how institutional continuity could transcend geographic distance. Though many such orders declined or were dissolved, their organizational models influenced later financial and military institutions. The expansion of vernacular literature strengthened collective consciousness. When epic stories, legal codes, and religious teachings were written in local languages, populations could engage directly with cultural narratives. Literacy gradually expanded beyond clerical elites. The empowerment of readers reshaped authority structures, as interpretation no longer depended solely on intermediaries. The rise of mechanical innovation, water, powered bellows, improved metalworking, and early clock mechanisms reflected confidence in engineering solutions. Each technological improvement enhanced productivity and expanded economic capacity. The willingness to refine tools and experiment with machinery prepared societies psychologically and practically for later industrial transformation. Monarchs who invested in standardized coinage improved economic reliability. Trust in consistent currency encouraged savings, loans, and broader market integration. Stable coinage became synonymous with stable governance. In certain regions, legal charters protected minority communities engaged in trade or scholarship. While often pragmatic and sometimes fragile, these protections recognized economic interdependence. Diversity within medieval cities contributed to innovation and cultural vitality. The establishment of maritime republics and merchant leagues demonstrated that power could be decentralized yet coordinated. These networks balanced autonomy with cooperation, offering alternative governance models beyond hereditary monarchy. The medieval refinement of fortification architecture, in response to artillery, demonstrated adaptive thinking. Military engineering evolved in cycles of challenge and response. This pattern of innovation under pressure would later characterize industrial and technological competition. Religious debates over poverty, wealth, and charity influenced economic ethics. The moral framing of commerce shaped attitudes toward profit and responsibility. Ethical discourse, intertwined with economic behavior, influencing emerging capitalist norms. The creation of libraries within monasteries and universities institutionalized knowledge preservation. Collections were catalogued and organized, allowing scholars to build upon previous work systematically. Knowledge accumulation became structured rather than accidental. Environmental adaptation, such as terrace farming in mountainous regions, demonstrated ingenuity in maximizing limited resources. These techniques sustained populations and supported regional stability. Medieval maritime exploration along African coasts and into the Atlantic reflected incremental confidence in navigation. Shipbuilders and sailors accumulated practical knowledge, pushing boundaries cautiously but steadily. The gradual integration of Roman legal principles into local customs strengthened uniformity in civil law across regions. Legal harmonization simplified trade and administration. The medieval conception of sovereignty evolved through conflict and negotiation. As rulers asserted exclusive authority within defined territories, political identity consolidated. Sovereignty became linked to borders, law, and centralized enforcement. The expansion of public markets and regulated trade spaces reflected trust in communal oversight. Market inspectors standardized weights and recorded transactions institutionalized fairness. The development of scholastic method trained thinkers to engage in structured debate. This habit of disciplined reasoning influenced intellectual culture far beyond theology. Even artistic decisions, Gothic architecture reaching upward with light-filled cathedrals, reflected cultural ambition and engineering prowess. These monumental projects required logistical coordination and financial planning on unprecedented scales. Across centuries, these choices accumulated. Medieval societies responded to crisis with adaptation, to opportunity with innovation, and to uncertainty with structure. Each incremental reform, whether in law, trade, technology, or governance, strengthened institutional resilience. The medieval world was not static darkness, but a dynamic arena of experimentation. Its leaders, merchants, scholars, artisans, and farmers confronted immediate challenges without knowing they were shaping global futures. Yet through steady institutional development, procedural governance, technological refinement, and cultural integration, they constructed frameworks that endured. Modern states, markets, universities, legal systems, and financial institutions all carry echoes of medieval foundations. The parchment contracts, guild halls, councils, shipyards, monasteries, and marketplaces of that era were not relics of a primitive age. They were workshops of structural innovation. What changed the world was not a single decree or battle, but a tapestry of decisions woven across centuries. Medieval people sought survival, order, faith, and prosperity. In doing so, they quietly built the durable architecture of civilization, an architecture within which the modern world continues to operate. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped humanity's internal sense of order. How people understood authority, responsibility, progress, and even the meaning of community. One of the most consequential developments was the slow transition from purely customary law to increasingly codified legal systems. In early medieval societies, tradition and oral precedent dominated dispute resolution. But as rulers and councils began committing laws to writing, they reduced ambiguity. Written codes created reference points beyond memory, and that shift strengthened predictability. Predictability encouraged economic expansion, migration, and investment. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped the psychology of power and the organization of society in ways so gradual that no generation fully perceived the transformation. One of the most significant shifts was the increasing reliance on councils rather than purely personal command. Kings, who once ruled through direct feudal loyalty, began surrounding themselves with advisory bodies composed of clerics, nobles, jurists, and eventually representatives of towns. While these councils initially existed to strengthen royal authority, their very existence institutionalized consultation. The idea that governance required deliberation slowly embedded itself into political culture. Over time, advisory bodies gained expectations of participation, evolving into more structured assemblies, whose voices could not easily be ignored. The development of heraldry was another subtle yet powerful change. When medieval elites adopted standardized coats of arms to identify lineage and allegiance, they created visual systems of identity. These symbols reinforced family continuity and territorial claims. Over centuries, heraldic traditions contributed to the broader concept of national symbols, flags, emblems, and seals that anchor modern political identity. The medieval decision to formalize visual identity shaped how communities recognized authority and belonging. Medieval taxation reforms quietly strengthened state capacity. As rulers moved from arbitrary levies to more regularized tax systems, they created predictable revenue streams. This predictability allowed long-term planning, funding infrastructure, fortifications, and administration. Taxation required assessment mechanisms, documentation, and enforcement procedures. Each of these required bureaucratic growth. The expansion of administrative literacy and record keeping transformed governance from episodic command into structured management. The use of seals and authentication marks on documents marked another critical step toward institutional trust. Seals symbolized legitimacy and authority, ensuring that written agreements carried recognized weight. This standardization of authentication enabled agreements across distances and between strangers. Over time, this practice evolved into notarization, certification, and official documentation processes central to modern law and commerce. The transformation of pilgrimage shrines into economic centers illustrated how spiritual and commercial decisions intertwined. When religious leaders chose to promote certain holy sites, infrastructure followed, roads improved, markets expanded, artisans relocated. These hubs became nodes of cultural exchange, accelerating urbanization and regional integration. Faith-driven mobility unintentionally strengthened trade networks and communication channels. The refinement of musical notation during the medieval period also had unexpected consequences. By systematizing how music was recorded, composers ensured consistency across vast regions. Shared liturgical music reinforced cultural cohesion across kingdoms. The broader implication was profound. Knowledge encoded symbolically could be transmitted accurately across time and space. This principle, abstract representation preserving complex information, underlies modern communication systems. In law, The development of jury systems gradually redistributed judicial authority. Instead of divine ordeal or unilateral judgment, communities participated in evaluating evidence. This involvement normalized civic responsibility within justice. The expectation that peers should weigh guilt or innocence embedded participatory norms into legal culture. In agriculture, water management decisions reshaped landscapes. Communities that built irrigation channels, dikes, and drainage systems demonstrated collective engineering capacity. The Dutch experience with land reclamation, for example, required cooperation and institutional coordination. Managing water collectively fostered governance models rooted in shared survival. Environmental necessity drove administrative innovation. The emergence of banking houses that maintained multi-generational operations demonstrated the power of institutional continuity. By structuring partnerships and inheritance strategies carefully, these families ensured that capital accumulation transcended individual lifespans. Financial durability allowed credit networks to expand across continents, supporting monarchs and merchants alike. Medieval manuscript preservation was itself a decision of immense consequence. Monks who copied texts, religious, scientific, literary, did so for devotion or scholarship, not for future historians. Yet their labour ensured that ancient knowledge survived wars, invasions, and decay. The preservation of classical philosophy, Roman law, and scientific treatises provided the intellectual raw material for later intellectual movements. The decision by some rulers to codify succession rules reduced internal conflict. Clear inheritance laws stabilized realms and minimized power struggles. Stability encouraged trade and population growth. Political predictability, even when imperfect, fostered economic confidence. Guild charters often included social welfare provisions, support for widows, aid for injured members, communal feasts, reinforcing solidarity. These practices reflected early forms of social insurance. The idea that occupational communities should care for members in hardship anticipated later welfare and labour protection systems. The gradual shift from feudal obligation to monetary rent payments altered social relationships. Peasants who paid rent rather than labour services gained increased autonomy over time management and productivity. This economic flexibility encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship within rural communities. Urban sanitation measures, though primitive, marked recognition of public health as communal responsibility. Regulations on waste disposal, market cleanliness, and water sources reflected awareness that collective action protected well-being. These early public health policies foreshadowed modern municipal governance. Maritime cartography evolved through practical necessity. Sailors who recorded coastlines and hazards contributed to more accurate maps. These cumulative improvements transformed geographical knowledge. Better mapping encouraged further exploration, trade expansion, and territorial awareness. Intellectual debates about free will and moral responsibility subtly reshaped concepts of individual accountability. As theologians examined intention and conscience, legal systems increasingly considered mental state in judgments. The medieval exploration of inner motivation influenced evolving legal and ethical frameworks. The institutionalization of charity through endowments and trusts demonstrated long-term thinking about social welfare. Wealthy patrons established foundations to support education, healthcare, and religious services beyond their lifetimes. The legal mechanisms enabling such endowments created durable philanthropic institutions. Cross-cultural diplomacy between Christian, Islamic, and Asian powers required negotiation protocols and translation practices. These interactions fostered mutual influence and technological exchange. Diplomatic norms developed through repeated contact, shaping international relations. The medieval embrace of mechanical innovation, water-powered hammers, improved looms, and milling systems, demonstrated willingness to augment human labor with machinery. Incremental mechanization prepared societies for later industrial acceleration. Literary traditions in vernacular languages strengthened regional identities. Epic poems and chronicles composed in local tongues created shared narratives that unified populations. Cultural cohesion supported emerging political consolidation. Even the structuring of daily life around regulated market days influenced economic rhythms. Predictable commerce schedules enabled planning and encouraged regional trade flows. The regularization of economic time complemented the mechanization of clock time. Over centuries, these layered choices intertwined. Documentation reinforced bureaucracy. Bureaucracy stabilized taxation. Taxation funded infrastructure. Infrastructure expanded trade. Trade encouraged innovation. Innovation strengthened administrative capacity. Medieval societies were constantly negotiating between tradition and necessity, improvising solutions that gradually hardened into institutions. What makes medieval decisions so powerful is not their immediate drama, but their endurance. Each charter drafted, tax system organized, irrigation channel dug, manuscript copied, guild formed, council convened, or contract sealed contributed a thread to an evolving fabric of civilization. The era's transformations were cumulative rather than explosive. By the close of the medieval period, the world was profoundly different from its early centuries. Governance was more institutional, economies more monetized, law more codified, knowledge more systematized, and societies more interconnected. None of this emerged from a single revolutionary moment. It emerged from centuries of decisions made by individuals responding to local pressures. The medieval world quietly built the architecture of continuity, structures capable of surviving rulers, disasters, and wars. Those structures, refined and expanded in later centuries, remain embedded in modern life. The documents we sign, the taxes we pay, the degrees we earn, the markets we trust, the courts we appeal to, the cities we inhabit, all carry within them the imprint of medieval choices. What appears to us as modern order is, in truth, the distant echo of decisions once made under torchlight and parchment. Decisions that seemed ordinary at the time, but ultimately reshaped the world. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped humanity. There were also medieval decisions born out of fear, survival, ambition, and faith, that reshaped the emotional and psychological structure of societies in ways that still echo today. When rulers began commissioning written law codes in vernacular languages, rather than keeping legal knowledge confined to Latin or elite circles, they quietly widened access to justice. Translating legal principles into languages spoken by ordinary people did more than improve comprehension. It reinforced the idea that law belonged to the community, not just to clerics or aristocrats. Over time, this gradual linguistic inclusion strengthened civic awareness and the expectation that governance should be understandable to those governed. The deliberate establishment of postal and messenger systems across large kingdoms also marked a turning point. Medieval rulers realized that controlling communication meant controlling power. Organized courier networks allowed faster coordination between distant territories. What began as royal necessity slowly evolved into broader communication infrastructures that supported trade, diplomacy, and intelligence. Reliable long-distance messaging reduced fragmentation and helped territories function as unified political entities. The modern expectation of centralized administration owes much to these early communication systems. The decision by certain rulers to conduct censuses and land surveys profoundly altered governance. When authorities counted households, assessed land values, and recorded economic resources, they created tools for taxation and military organization. But they also produced a new way of seeing society as quantifiable, classifiable, and manageable through data. This administrative mindset laid foundations for modern statecraft. Where statistics inform policy, medieval surveys were primitive compared to modern data systems. Yet they represented a shift from personal rule towards systemic oversight. Another subtle transformation occurred in inheritance practices. As primogeniture became more common in parts of Europe, concentrating land in the hands of eldest sons, social mobility patterns shifted. Younger sons often sought fortunes in the church, military orders, or trade. This redistribution of ambition fed institutions beyond traditional agriculture, strengthening urban economies, clerical hierarchies, and mercantile ventures. A family strategy designed to preserve estates inadvertently diversified professional classes and accelerated economic complexity. Maritime republics such as Genoa and Venice made deliberate choices to prioritize naval power and commercial treaties over territorial conquest. By investing in fleets and trade agreements, they demonstrated that influence could be achieved through economic leverage rather than solely through land-based warfare. Their contracts, insurance practices, and risk-sharing ventures resembled early capitalist frameworks. The idea that wealth and influence could be generated through structured trade networks reshaped geopolitical thinking. The development of hospitals as organized institutions was another quiet revolution. While charity and care for the sick existed earlier, medieval hospital foundations institutionalized healthcare as a communal responsibility. These facilities were often religiously motivated, yet they represented an organized approach to medical care. Over centuries, the institutional model of centralized patient care evolved into modern healthcare systems. The recognition that illness required structured response and specialized knowledge fostered advancements in medical education. Medieval architectural planning also influenced civic life. The deliberate design of marketplaces, defensive walls, and public squares shaped patterns of social interaction. Town squares became spaces for trade, proclamation, and community gathering. By physically structuring communal space, medieval planners influenced how societies communicated and resolved disputes. The urban blueprint of centralized civic space remains fundamental in modern city design. The gradual monetization of economies represented another major shift. As coinage and currency exchange replaced barter systems in many regions, economic relationships became more abstract. Monetary taxation allowed rulers to hire professional soldiers rather than rely solely on feudal levies. This financial flexibility supported centralized states and professional administrations. Currency also encouraged saving, lending, and investment, core principles of modern financial systems. In parts of Africa and Asia, rulers who protected caravan routes or maritime lanes effectively shaped global trade patterns. Decisions to secure trade corridors ensured stability and attracted merchants from distant regions. Trade hubs flourished, not merely because of geography, but because of deliberate policy. Protection and regulation of commerce demonstrated that political stability and economic prosperity were deeply intertwined. The codification of chivalric ideals influenced cultural norms about honor, loyalty, and conduct. Though often romanticized, these codes attempted to regulate violence among warrior elites. By embedding behavioral expectations within a moral framework, medieval societies sought to civilize martial power. The concept that authority carries ethical responsibility evolved through such codes, influencing later discussions about just war and military conduct. Religious councils that clarified doctrine also had lasting impact. By defining orthodoxy and heresy, medieval institutions shaped intellectual boundaries. While sometimes suppressive, these decisions also fostered systematic theology and structured debate. The tension between authority and inquiry stimulated philosophical development. Over time, challenges to doctrinal authority catalyzed reform movements and redefined religious landscapes. The rise of merchant diasporas demonstrated how cultural flexibility supported economic success. Communities that adapted linguistically and legally across regions created durable trade networks. Their decisions to maintain cultural cohesion while integrating economically allowed cross-cultural exchange on unprecedented scales. These networks foreshadowed modern global business communities. In agricultural life, the selective breeding of crops and livestock reflected incremental experimentation. Farmers who improved seed varieties or livestock traits enhanced resilience and productivity. These cumulative biological innovations strengthened food security, enabling urban expansion and specialization of labor. The medieval emphasis on oath, taking as a binding social mechanism, also shaped legal culture. Oaths were sacred commitments, blending spiritual accountability with legal obligation. The seriousness attached to sworn testimony laid groundwork for modern judicial procedures, where truthfulness under oath remains central educational curricular decisions in cathedral schools and universities influenced intellectual priorities for centuries by organizing knowledge into structured disciplines. Law, medicine, theology, and the liberal arts. Medieval educators shaped the architecture of academic study. Modern degree systems and departmental divisions reflect this inherited framework. The establishment of public granaries and emergency reserves in certain regions represented early forms of social welfare. Authorities who stored surplus grain to mitigate famine recognized the importance of collective security. These measures illustrated an emerging sense that governance included responsibility for public survival. Marriages arranged for political alliances also quietly redrew maps. Dynastic unions united territories without warfare, consolidating states and influencing succession patterns. These matrimonial decisions altered political boundaries and stabilized regions, sometimes for generations. Even the aesthetic choices of manuscript illumination and artistic symbolism shaped collective imagination. Visual storytelling in stained glass and illustrated texts educated largely illiterate populations. Shared imagery created cohesive cultural narratives, embedding moral lessons and historical memory into daily life. The medieval world continuously adapted through negotiation between tradition and innovation. Each adaptation, whether in governance, trade, agriculture, education, religion, or technology, represented a choice made under specific circumstances. Those choices accumulated, interlinked, and reinforced one another. Gradually, authority became institutional rather than purely personal. Economies became monetized and interconnected. Knowledge became organized and preserved systematically. Law became codified and documented. Time became measured. Territory became defined. Identity became tied to community and state. None of these developments occurred overnight. They were the product of countless small decisions made by rulers seeking stability, merchants pursuing profit, scholars searching for truth, farmers striving for survival, and communities responding to crisis. Yet together, these medieval decisions quietly reshaped the architecture of civilization. The modern world, with its bureaucracies, financial systems, universities, legal traditions, and global networks, is not a sudden invention of recent centuries. It is the layered outcome of medieval experimentation, adaptation, and compromise, carried forward across generations until the foundations laid in that distant era became the structure within which we now live. There were also medieval decisions that reshaped how humans understood authority, community, and even the individual self-transformations so gradual that they feel natural to us now. One of the most consequential shifts was the increasing use of written contracts in everyday life, whether for marriage arrangements, land leases, merchant partnerships. There were also medieval decisions that unfolded so gradually, so quietly within institutions and daily life, that their consequences feel almost invisible today, even though they shape our assumptions about authority, identity, and progress. Consider the choice by medieval rulers to formalize borders through treaties, rather than rely solely on shifting feudal loyalties. When kingdoms negotiated territorial boundaries in writing, they strengthened the concept of a defined political space, an early step toward the modern nation-state. Instead of power being purely personal and tied to oaths between individuals, it began to attach itself to land mapped and described. This administrative evolution slowly transformed political identity from loyalty to a lord into attachment to a realm. Ecclesiastical reforms also had profound structural impact. During the 11th century, reformers within the Church pushed for clerical celibacy and freedom from lay investiture, culminating in conflicts like the investiture controversy. When secular rulers and popes struggled over who had the authority to appoint bishops, the debate was not only religious, but constitutional. The eventual compromises clarified spheres of influence between spiritual and temporal powers. That separation, however imperfect, contributed to a Western political tradition in which religious and governmental authorities were distinct entities. Over centuries, this differentiation would influence arguments for secular governance and institutional checks and balances. The codification of maritime laws was another understated turning point. Medieval merchants trading across the Mediterranean and the Baltic required predictable rules to settle disputes at sea. Collections such as the Rolls of Olferon standardized maritime customs by agreeing to shared commercial principles across ports and cultures. Traders reduced uncertainty and risk. These early maritime codes influenced later admiralty law and the regulation of international shipping, reinforcing the idea that commerce thrives under consistent legal frameworks. Medieval guilds formed to protect artisans' interests also made choices that would echo forward. By setting standards for quality, training apprentices, and regulating competition, guilds created early professional identities. The apprenticeship model institutionalized skill transmission, embedding structured education within trades. Although guild restrictions could limit innovation, they also ensured craftsmanship standards and community solidarity. The idea that professions require certification, training, and ethical obligations can be traced back to these medieval corporate bodies. In Scandinavia and parts of the British Isles, assemblies such as the Althing in Iceland embodied traditions of collective decision-making. These gatherings allowed free men to debate laws and resolve disputes publicly. Though limited in inclusivity by modern standards, they demonstrated that governance could involve deliberation rather than pure autocracy. The preservation of such assemblies offered enduring examples of participatory political culture. The decision to record property transactions in written charters rather than rely solely on oral agreements marked another subtle shift. Written documentation increased stability in economic relationships and reduced reliance on memory or personal testimony. Over time, the habit of documentation expanded into bureaucratic record keeping, census, taking, and taxation systems. Administrative literacy became essential to governance, encouraging states to develop archives and trained officials. The bureaucratic state that defines much of modern governance rests on these medieval habits of writing and preserving records. Even responses to climate challenges mattered. During the medieval warm period, agricultural expansion was possible in regions previously too cold for reliable cultivation. Communities that chose to exploit these conditions established settlements in new territories, including parts of Greenland and northern Europe. Later, during the onset of the Little Ice Age, adaptations in farming and infrastructure reflected resilience and innovation. Environmental pressures prompted institutional responses that influenced migration, economic diversification, and social organization. The integration of mechanical clocks into urban centers during the late medieval period subtly transformed human perception of time. Public clocks regulated work hours, market schedules, and religious observance with increasing precision. Time became more standardized and measurable, no longer tied solely to natural rhythms or church bells marking prayer. This growing precision in timekeeping laid groundwork for later industrial discipline and coordination. The medieval decision to mechanize time altered how societies structured daily life. Military centralization was another gradual evolution, as rulers invested in gunpowder weapons and fortifications adapted to artillery, the cost of warfare increased dramatically. Maintaining cannons and trained soldiers required steady revenue streams, which in turn required more sophisticated taxation systems. This fiscal military cycle strengthened centralized states and reduced the autonomy of local lords. Though driven by immediate defense concerns, these choices fostered administrative complexity and state capacity that would later support infrastructure, public works, and colonial ventures. In intellectual life, medieval debates about reason and revelation cultivated habits of structured argument. Scholastic disputation required participants to articulate objections, respond systematically, and distinguish between different types of authority. This disciplined approach to argumentation influenced later academic methodology. The medieval university's emphasis on dialectic reasoning prepared the ground for analytical frameworks still used in philosophy, law, and theology. Across Asia, technological decisions had similarly enduring consequences. The refinement of printing with movable type in East Asia predated European developments, and widespread use of paper expanded literacy and record. Keeping bureaucratic governance benefited from efficient documentation. The circulation of printed materials enhanced cultural continuity and educational access. Though these innovations were integrated within specific political contexts, they demonstrated how technological adoption shapes administrative reach and social cohesion. In Mesoamerica, complex calendar systems and agricultural innovations like chenampas reflected deliberate choices to align society with environmental knowledge. While these developments were interrupted by later conquests, they illustrate that medieval-era civilizations worldwide were making sophisticated institutional and ecological decisions that structured daily life and governance. The growth of pilgrimage networks across Europe and the Middle East connected distant regions through shared spiritual journeys. Infrastructure, such as roads, hostels, and marketplaces, expanded to serve travelers. Pilgrimage routes facilitated cultural exchange, trade, and communication across linguistic and political boundaries. These networks fostered a sense of belonging to a broader community that transcended local identity. Monarchs' decisions to commission chronicles and official histories also shaped collective memory. By selecting which events to record and how to frame them, medieval rulers influenced national narratives. These chronicles preserved genealogies, legitimized dynasties, and defined enemies and heroes. Historical consciousness, awareness of a shared past, became a political tool. The shaping of narrative identity in the medieval era continues to influence modern national mythologies. Legal protections for universities and scholars, granting them certain immunities, signaled recognition of intellectual labor as socially valuable. These privileges allowed scholars relative independence from local authorities, encouraging inquiry that might otherwise have been suppressed. The notion of academic freedom, however limited in scope, has medieval precedents in these institutional protections. Monetary reforms, including the stabilization of coinage and regulation of mints, also had cascading effects. Reliable currency encouraged long-distance trade and taxation efficiency. Inflation control and trust in coin purity supported economic stability. Financial credibility became an asset of governance, reinforcing the interdependence between political authority and economic confidence. even small-scale communal decisions, such as the management of common lands, contributed to evolving legal thought. Rules governing grazing, wood collection, and water rights required negotiation and enforcement. Customary law developed around shared resources, embedding the idea that communities could self-regulate collectively owned assets. These practices influenced later debates about property rights and communal governance. The medieval synthesis of Roman, Germanic, Christian, Islamic, and other cultural influences generated hybrid legal and social systems that proved adaptable. Adaptability itself may be the era's most enduring legacy. Faced with plagues, invasions, climatic shifts, and political fragmentation, medieval societies repeatedly experimented with solutions. Some failed, others endured and spread. What makes these decisions remarkable is not that they were consciously revolutionary, but that they accumulated. Each charter, reform, innovation, and institutional compromise addressed immediate needs. Yet layered over centuries, these responses redefined governance, economy, law, education, technology, and identity. The medieval world was not a pause between antiquity and modernity, but a crucible of transformation. Its quiet administrative reforms and intellectual pursuits, beyond the well-known charters, crusades, and voyages, there were quieter medieval choices that redirected the flow of history in ways so gradual that contemporaries could not see the transformation taking place. In the 8th and 9th centuries, for example, when Charlemagne chose to standardize liturgy, script, and education across his empire, he was attempting to unify a vast and diverse territory under clearer administrative control. Yet, the promotion of the Carolingian minuscule, a more legible script, made texts easier to copy and read, preserving classical works that might otherwise have vanished. This seemingly administrative decision improved literacy among clergy and officials, and ensured that fragments of ancient philosophy, law, and science survived into later centuries. Without that reform of handwriting and schooling, much of Europe's intellectual inheritance could have been irretrievably lost. The choice by rulers to grant towns charters was another subtle revolution. Across medieval Europe, monarchs and lords issued documents granting urban communities rights of self-governance, trade privileges, and legal protections. These charters were often pragmatic deals. Rulers gained loyal taxpayers and economic growth. Towns gained autonomy. Yet in granting urban freedoms, rulers unintentionally nurtured civic identity and political participation outside feudal hierarchies. Burghers elected councils, regulated markets, and resolved disputes. Over time, these towns became laboratories of self-rule, commercial law, and civic responsibility. The decision to empower cities contributed to the erosion of rigid feudal structures and strengthened the social classes that would later champion constitutionalism and market economies. In religious life, the reforms of monastic orders had far-reaching impact when figures like Francis of Assisi embraced radical poverty and founded movements dedicated to preaching and service among ordinary people. They were responding to spiritual concerns about wealth and corruption within the church. Yet the mendicant order's decision to move into towns and engage directly with urban populations transformed religious culture, education, charity, and preaching became more accessible. Universities benefited from friars who were trained scholars, blending spiritual life with intellectual rigor. This integration of faith and scholarship influenced ethical debates, social policy, and the moral language of Europe for centuries. Legal codifications outside Western Europe also shaped the modern world. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian I had earlier commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, but its rediscovery and study in medieval Italy profoundly influenced European legal traditions. The revival of Roman law in places like Bologna offered systematic principles of contracts, property, and governance. As monarchs sought to centralize authority, they drew upon these legal frameworks. The blending of Roman legal theory with local customs laid the groundwork for civil law systems still used across much of the globe. In the Islamic world, decisions by caliphs and scholars to sponsor learning in centers such as Baghdad during the Abbasid period nurtured advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The preservation and enhancement of Greek knowledge, combined with original contributions like algebra and refined astronomical tables, later filtered into Europe through translation movements. The medieval commitment to scholarship in these regions ensured that scientific inquiry did not vanish, but instead evolved ready to influence other civilizations. These intellectual investments, motivated by curiosity and religious encouragement to seek knowledge, ultimately strengthened global scientific traditions. Trade networks also depended on choices that seemed practical rather than visionary. The formation of the Hanseatic League, an alliance of merchant guilds and towns in northern Europe, was driven by the need for mutual protection and commercial advantage. Yet, by coordinating standards, securing trade routes, and negotiating collectively, these merchants created an early model of economic cooperation across political boundaries. Their agreements reduced piracy, stabilized prices, and encouraged long-distance commerce. This cooperative commercial framework foreshadowed later economic unions and demonstrated that shared economic interests could transcend local rivalries. The decision by English nobles to invite William of Orange centuries later in the Glorious Revolution had medieval constitutional roots in earlier limitations on royal power. Medieval precedents about consent and lawful governance informed later resistance to absolutism. The chain of cause and effect stretched back to those earlier charters and parliamentary practices. Medieval compromises created expectations that rulers could be challenged, that law had authority independent of the crown, and that governance required some degree of shared legitimacy. Military innovations also altered social structures. The adoption of the longbow in England, particularly during conflicts like the 100 Years' War, demonstrated that disciplined infantry could defeat heavily armoured knights. This tactical shift weakened the military dominance of the feudal aristocracy. When common soldiers proved decisive on the battlefield, the social prestige of mounted nobility began to erode. Warfare gradually became less about individual chivalric prowess and more about organization, training, and technology. This transition influenced state formation, as monarchs invested in standing forces rather than relying solely on feudal levies. Financial decisions quietly reshaped economies as well. Italian banking families developed instruments such as bills of exchange, allowing merchants to move money across long distances without physically transporting coins. These innovations reduced risk and facilitated international trade. Though devised to solve practical commercial problems, they laid foundations for modern banking and credit systems. The medieval experimentation with finance demonstrated that trust, documentation, and networks could replace purely metal-based currency exchange. Even architectural choices had social consequences. The construction of Gothic cathedrals required coordinated labor, advanced engineering, and urban cooperation. Funding these massive projects involved fundraising campaigns, indulgences, and community contributions. The very act of building such structures fostered civic pride and collective identity. Skilled artisans refined techniques in stonework and glassmaking, pushing the boundaries of engineering knowledge. These collaborative enterprises illustrated how shared belief could mobilize large populations toward common goals. A pattern later mirrored in civic and national projects. Environmental management decisions also left lasting marks. Medieval communities that implemented crop rotation systems, such as the three-field system, enhanced soil fertility and reduced famine risk. This agricultural planning was not revolutionary in a single moment, but over time it stabilized food supplies and supported population recovery after crises. A more reliable food base encouraged trade specialization and urban growth, further diversifying economies. In Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, the choice to adopt or resist certain religious affiliations influenced cultural and political alignments. When rulers selected Christianity, Islam, or other faiths as state religions, they tied their realms to broader networks of diplomacy, trade, and scholarship. Religious alignment shaped alliances, legal codes, artistic traditions, and educational systems. These spiritual decisions were simultaneously geopolitical ones, embedding kingdoms within transregional communities that influenced their development for centuries. The medieval period also witnessed the gradual articulation of natural rights within theological debates. Thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas explored the relationship between divine law and human law, arguing that unjust laws could lack moral authority. Though framed within a religious worldview, such arguments subtly advanced the idea that legitimacy depends on justice. This moral reasoning would later nourish Enlightenment philosophies about rights and governance. Meanwhile, in Africa, the rise of trade empires like Mali depended on strategic control of gold and salt routes. Decisions by rulers to regulate trade, maintain caravan safety, and encourage scholarship, such as in the city of Timbuktu, helped integrate West Africa into global commerce. These policies fostered cultural exchange and economic vitality long before European colonial expansion. The cumulative effect of these medieval decisions is striking. None were undertaken with a modern blueprint in mind. Rulers sought stability, profit, or spiritual favor. Scholars pursued truth within accepted frameworks. Merchants aimed for safer trade. Peasants adopted better tools for survival. Yet, from these localized and often pragmatic choices emerged principles and systems that define modern life, rule of law, representative governance, global trade networks, universities, financial instruments, professional bureaucracies, and technological adaptation. The medieval world was not static or uniformly dark. It was dynamic, experimental, and interconnected. Its leaders and communities made choices in response to immediate challenges, unaware that their responses would ripple outward across centuries. In legal halls, monasteries, markets, shipyards, and battlefields, decisions accumulated. Each parchment sealed, each charter granted, Each tool adopted, each text translated, added another thread to a tapestry that would eventually form the foundations of the modern global order. The world we inhabit, shaped by law, commerce, scholarship, and statecraft.